Born the illegitimate daughter of a Rothschild, she married into one of the oldest families in England and saved Highclere Castle from ruin. She funded expeditions in Egypt that uncovered the greatest archaeological find of the century, carried on a scandalous affair with the last prince of the Sikh Empire, and fled her home when she feared she might bear his child. Her husband died, some whispered, by a mummy's curse. She built wartime hospitals, refused royal honors, had an affair with her husband's undertaker, and was dragged through one of the most explosive divorce trials in British history. So scandalous, the king himself was forced to intervene. And in the end, she was cast out of the castle she had saved, by the very son she had protected. From the grandeur of Highclere Castle, to the sands of Egypt where pharaohs lay, to the final embers of the Sikh Empire, to the gilded salons of Edwardian England, this is a story like no other. She saved lives, unearthed kings, restored a castle, and was nearly erased from history. If you like stories like this, please consider joining the channel. We have over 80 biographies on incredible women throughout history, some who have never had their stories told properly, and we could really use your support. Now let's get into the story of the real Downton Abbey and Lady Almina Herbert, the mistress of Highclere Castle. Some women are born with names carved in stone, titles waiting like wedding dresses, estates waiting like altars. Almina Victoria Marie Alexandra Wombwell was not one of them. She arrived on the 14th of August, 1876, in a London where names mattered more than anything, and hers didn't. On her birth certificate stood the name of Captain Frederick Charles Wombwell, an old baronet family scion whose fortune had long since drained away at the card table. He offered only the illusion of legitimacy. He wasn't at her birth. He never came after. He was a father in ink. Everyone who mattered knew the truth. Sir Alfred de Rothschild was her father. The banker, the bachelor, the man with diamond buttons on his waistcoats and orchestras in his drawing room. He owned Rembrandts, palaces, and more porcelain than Versailles. And yet, despite all that, he remained marked as an outsider. Too Jewish, too flamboyant, too unorthodox for an England obsessed with bloodlines. Alfred adored Almina. He paid for her governesses, her nurse, her riding lessons. Later, he promised her a dowry vast enough to rescue a failing estate. But he never gave her his name other than in a cipher. Her name, Almina, was the combination of his first name, Alfred, and her mother's name, Mina. He paid for the house in which she grew up. 20 Portman Square, a tall, dignified structure in Marylebone with polished floors, imported wallpaper, and just enough staff to make it respectable without inviting curiosity. A house not too grand to attract scandal, not too modest to invite pity. Her mother, Marie Mina Wombwell, French-born and ambitious, understood the bargain. Her beauty had secured Rothschild's favor. Her daughter was her investment. She raised Almina not as a child to be cherished, but as a project to be perfected, groomed for grace, for charm, for society. Affection in Almina's world was conditional. A legal father who existed only on paper, a biological father who loved her through checks and jewels, and a mother who saw her future as capital. Illegitimacy in Victorian England was more than gossip. It was a stain with consequences. It could bar a girl from court. It could poison a marriage prospect. It could be whispered at the very moment her future was on the line. Almina had wealth without welcome. She was an heiress in the mirror, dazzling in reflection, absent from the family portrait. And soon, that fortune without a name would collide with the realities of Victorian society, where a girl's value was not who she was, but who she could marry. Almina grew up with soft hands and hard eyes. She learned early that wealth did not mean welcome. In late Victorian London, money was admired, but names were obeyed. A dukedom might be bankrupt and still command reverence. A Rothschild might be wealthier than the crown and still find the door half closed. This was the contradiction that defined her youth. She had her mother's beauty, her father's fortune, and a birth that left her exposed. No one told her that directly. She was simply never quite invited. Not to the inner circles, not to the real tables. She learned to accept invitations with perfect posture and a practiced smile. She studied the women around her, how they left food on their plates, how they tilted teacups at just the right angle, how they used laughter like fencing foils. Her mother, Marie, had once been lovely. Now she was something else, brittle, watchful, preserved like a pressed flower between the pages of scandal. She carried herself with dignity, but it was a dignity sharpened by necessity. They kept mostly to themselves, not by choice but by design. At the center of her life stood Alfred de Rothschild, to many dazzling, to others suspect. Halton House, Alfred's Buckinghamshire palace, a Viennese fantasia of mirrors and Hungarian carpets, where orchestras played as if Versailles had risen again in English field, was the one place Almina felt truly free. Here, Almina was never publicly acknowledged as Alfred's daughter. Yet everyone understood. She was treated as someone just short of legitimate. She moved through those mirrored halls as a girl observing a play, learning how spectacle was arranged, how magnificence was orchestrated, how display itself was a form of power. Halton was her classroom in grandeur, and one day, those lessons would echo through the corridors of Highclere. Her tutors and governesses reflected her role. She was being polished, not educated. French lessons to charm at a salon, piano to delight a drawing room, posture drilled until her spine was a line of etiquette. Only one skill gave her freedom: riding. On horseback, she could escape the whispering arithmetic of society. Galloping across fields, she outran the silence of her birth. But everything else reinforced her role. She was not being raised to ask questions. She was being raised to enter rooms flawlessly, a performance rehearsed since childhood. At 17, she was sent to Paris for finishing school. Among the daughters of bankers and barons, she learned how to glide rather than walk, how to answer a question without giving anything away, how to exist like a painting, admired but untouchable. She returned fluent in French, adept in music and manners, polished until she shone. By the spring of 1895, Almina was 19 and dazzling. Draped in Parisian silks that caught the gaslight just so, she moved through London like a whispered rumor. Her childhood taught her 3 lessons: that beauty could be arranged, that belonging could not be bought, that every silence had a price. Soon those lessons would be tested in the blaze of the London season, a world of feathers, fans, and marriages arranged like contracts. In this society, daughters were assets. A girl's value was measured in 3 neat columns: beauty, manners, dowry. Education was ornamental, tolerated only if it made her more agreeable. The season was the marketplace, and Almina's case was unique. She had everything and nothing: the fortune of a princess, the surname of a ruined captain, the blood of a Jewish financier. She could rescue an estate. She could also ruin it. By the 1880s and 1890s, the aristocracy was wobbling. Agricultural depression thinned rents, death duties devoured inheritances. Grand houses glittered on the outside while leaking ruin behind their silk curtains. Into that crisis flowed new fortunes: American heiresses, Rothschild bankers, merchant dynasties. Their money kept the fountains flowing and the butlers paid. But not all wealth was equal. An American Vanderbilt could marry a duke and be excused as exotic. A Rothschild heiress could be admired and still kept at arm's length. And an illegitimate Rothschild daughter, no matter how dazzling her dowry, was a gamble. Almina was salvation and scandal, wrapped in the same Paris silk. The season was not romance. It was commerce dressed as spectacle. On the morning of her presentation at court, she rose before dawn to begin the ritual. White gown, white gloves, 3 ostrich feathers in her hair, absurd by modern eyes, but in the 1890s, mandatory plumage. She was presented before Queen Victoria, nearly blind by then, dulled by years of ceremony. The Queen saw hundreds of girls each season, each curtsying deeply, each rising slowly, eyes lowered, daughters launched like ships, some destined to sail, others to founder. No record survives of what the Queen thought of Almina. But she passed without comment. In this theater, silence was success. She had crossed the threshold. The girl born in whispers now wore society's stamp of approval. But approval was not affection. Among the gilded girls. In the weeks that followed, Almina glided through drawing rooms thick with lilies and expectation. She danced beneath chandeliers, her wrist brushed by gloved fingers. Almina wore Parisian silks that caught the gaslight just so. Rothschild jewels glittered at her throat. Her posture was perfect, her French fluent, her smile precisely timed. By every measure, she dazzled. And yet, there was always the but. She was beautiful, but illegitimate. She was polished, but foreign. She was wealthy, but Rothschild. Society never told her outright. It didn't need to. The silence after her name said enough. The dowagers in corners, the faint hesitation before introductions, the murmur just beyond earshot. Almina became an expert in silences. She learned to disarm men with charm, to flatter women into feeling superior, to glide through rooms as if nothing could touch her. She played the part flawlessly, even as she knew she was being judged like an equation. Aristocratic mothers whispered, calculated, and did their sums. Their sons noticed her gowns, but their ledgers noticed her fortune. In a society where grandeur was expensive and estates were crumbling, Almina was not just a young woman, she was a solution. But a solution that came with a question mark. For all their talk of breeding, even the grandest houses needed repairing. New roofs cost money, so did land agents, carriages, and coal. Almina was not a pawn, she was a wild card, and one man could not afford to pass her by. George was 29, slim, courteous, Eton and Cambridge polished, descended from the conquest. He owned houses across 5 counties, dined with royalty, carried himself with quiet grace. But appearances are liars. The House of Carnarvon was showing its seams. The estates were vast, but the debts vaster. Paintings hung straight, but plaster cracked behind silk wallpaper. The library was stocked, but the footmen were fewer. The champagne bottles lighter. The rot began not with ruin, but with restraint. George was not reckless. He was shy, contemplative, more drawn to manuscripts than to Parliament. He adored gadgets, the thrum of early motor cars, the possibilities of photography. In time with her money, he would fund the most famous archaeological discovery of the century. But in 1894, his excavation was not in Egypt. It was in Mayfair, and he was digging for a fortune. Highclere Castle was magnificent, but magnificence doesn't pay butlers. His mother whispered the solution every great house whispered when debts outweighed glory: marriage. As the London season unfolded, George began to notice Almina. She was everywhere and nowhere. Never splashed in the gossip sheets, but impossible to miss. In flickering gaslight, she was the girl with the Parisian gowns, the perfect posture, the unreadable smile. He watched her. She fascinated him. She didn't laugh too brightly or linger too long. She played the part, yet seemed always slightly apart from it, like someone watching herself perform. She made sense, and Almina understood the glances, the hesitation, the calculation. She knew what her presence meant: solvency. She knew what George represented: a title, a seat in history. He invited her to come and visit Highclere, his family home. She saw it for the first time on a clear spring afternoon, the kind of day England offers as a bribe in May, all light winds and green softness. The carriage came up the long drive beneath the cedars, and there it stood, not a house, but a statement. Highclere Castle, immense, impassive, impossible. She said nothing, but her gloves tightened slightly. The scale alone could stun a girl. Its 300 rooms, the towers reaching into cloud, the lawn cut like tapestry. This was not Rothschild money, curated and continental. This was England itself, with all its weight and whispering stones. George met her on the steps, courtly and quiet, offering his hand as though they had known each other longer than they had. He had a voice that rarely rose, a gaze that rarely lingered, and the kind of polish that made even his silences feel credentialed. He spoke to her about the cedar trees planted generations ago by some distant ancestor, about the library, the Egyptian faience, the tapestries faded by sunlight in rooms only opened for royalty. He did not speak of money. He didn't need to. Inside, his mother, Elsie, greeted Almina with a warmth that caught her off guard. No frost, no curtness, only a steady look and a remark that wasn't flattery, but something more enduring. "You'll do," Elsie said, her voice dry as old linen. "This house needs someone who can outrun its ghosts." She stayed 3 days, long enough to memorize the corridors, to observe the staff, how many, how silent, how trained to disappear before being seen. When she returned to London, she carried with her a bouquet of pressed violets from the castle greenhouse and a sense that her life was already shifting. The real meeting came days later, when George visited Alfred de Rothschild. The scene was business, not romance. Rothschild agreed. In exchange for his goddaughter's hand, he would settle Carnarvon's debts, guarantee £12,000 a year, more than $6.5 million today, and secure the inheritance of any children. A contract was drawn. A life was purchased. Lord Burghclere, Carnarvon's brother-in-law, wrote with bluntness, "Porchy likes the girl, and that being so, the rest will follow." Shortly after, Carnarvon left England on a steam yacht bound for South America, accompanied by his friend Prince Victor Duleep Singh. It was a strange gesture of timing to secure a bride and then vanish abroad. But perhaps it suited him. He was not a man of sweeping declarations. He was reserved, cerebral, drawn more to travel and engines and ideas than to sentiment. On the 26th of June, 1895, London woke to a day made for ceremony. The air was sharp with early summer, the stone of Westminster glowing pale against a sky polished to silver blue. Inside St. Margaret's Church, the 1,000-year-old nave had been transformed into a garden. Tall palms flanked the aisles like sentinels, ferns filled the recesses, and the chancel overflowed with lilies, orchids, peonies, and roses. The perfume of English summer mingled with something exotic, almost foreign. It was a spectacle, and everyone knew why. This was not just a marriage. It was a reconciliation between scandal and society, inked in Rothschild gold and sanctified by the Church. The pews were crowded. Queen Victoria's ministers, foreign dignitaries, society hostesses, mothers with daughters to parade. Some smiled, some whispered, some measured with cool eyes. They had opinions, but none could deny that every seat was filled. Almina, 19 and impossibly luminous, entered on Alfred de Rothschild's arm. Her gown, cut in Paris, glowed white against the dark stone. Gasps rustled through the pews, admiration in some throats, disapproval in others. Whispers darted like minnows. Yet none of it mattered as she moved steadily up the aisle, gaze lowered, smile measured, every inch the bride she had been trained to become. At the chancel stood George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, slender and reserved on his 29th birthday. His best friend, Prince Victor Duleep Singh, son of the last Maharaj of the Sikh Empire, stood as best man. In time, Victor's name would return in whispers, an affair with Almina, a scandal, an illegitimate heir. But for now, that lay in the future. The choir's voices trembled in the vaulted air. The vows were spoken with precision. Rings exchanged, the register signed. In a single morning, Almina crossed an invisible threshold. She entered illegitimate. She emerged as a countess. Tradition dictated that the bride's family host the breakfast, but Marie Wumbwell was not received, and Alfred de Rothschild had no wife's drawing room to lend. Into this breach stepped Mrs. Astor, offering Lansdowne House on Berkeley Square, neutral, magnificent, and suitably grand. The mansion bloomed with flowers. Hydrangeas filled the entrance hall. Every room had its own theme. In the saloon, palms framed a Viennese orchestra, their waltzes drifting through corridors of gilt and silk. Champagne shimmered in one room. A 3-tiered cake towered in another. On display, as if in a gallery, were the gifts. From Alfred, an emerald necklace and tiara fit for a countess. From others, crystal vases, gold scent bottles, objets de vertu, jeweled ornaments for George from the Prince of Wales. Silver, discreet but unmistakable. If there were mutters at the sudden elevation of Almina, they were muted. For the day, at least, society held its tongue. Late in the afternoon, the couple departed. At Paddington Station, George discarded formality, wearing his worn blue jacket and straw hat, while Almina glittered in pompadour gauze, diamonds catching the last of the light beneath a Parisian hat. The train pulled them west to Hampshire. At Highclere Station, a landau awaited. As they entered the park, a floral arch rose above the drive. The horses were unhitched. The carriage was pulled by the estate staff themselves, 20 men in shirt sleeves, while the Newbury Town Band played a march for their new mistress. The people cheered, the castle loomed, and the countess arrived at her seat of power. For Almina, it was the moment her training found its purpose. The title, the house, the standing, they were hers now. But in certain corridors of Highclere, she would always be a guest. And though her money would restore the castle, fund expeditions in Egypt, and save the dynasty one day, from the most unlikely source, she would be asked to leave. They arrived just after sunset, the light falling gold across the chalk hills, the carriage wheels whispering over gravel too fine to crack. The girl inside wore Rothschild pearls and a new title. Ahead, rising from Capability Brown's sculpted illusion of wilderness, the house appeared all at once, not in stages, but as a revelation. Highclere Castle. Hundreds of windows, each one watching, a tower of Bath stone, something between a cathedral and a citadel. It wasn't built to charm, it was built to last and to look down at you while it did. Though the current house was only 40 years old, rebuilt by Sir Charles Barry, the same architect who designed the Houses of Parliament, the land itself bore older names. In 749, an Anglo-Saxon king granted it to the bishops of Winchester. For 8 centuries it was sacred ground, gardens laid out by William of Wykeham, halls walked by Edward II himself. It appeared in the Domesday Book. It survived the Black Death. It held fast through Plantagenet feuds and Tudor flames. In 1551, during the Reformation, it passed to the crown under Edward VI. The abbey fell. The stones remained. By the 17th century, it became Highclere Place House, reworked by Sir Robert Sawyer, Attorney General under Charles II. A square Jacobean manor with thick walls, low ceilings, and no memory of monks. But it was Henry Herbert, the 3rd Earl, who dreamed of a castle. He hired Sir Charles Barry, and together, between 1842 and 1849, they buried the old house beneath the Gothic. Barry gave it towers, turrets, finials, and a skyline that demanded reverence. He called it Anglo-Italian. The locals called it a palace. Inside, a saloon rose 50 feet beneath a glazed roof, wrapped in 17th century Spanish leather, a music room draped in Florentine embroidery, a gallery of vanished faces. Even in 1895, the leather still held the scent of oranges and dust. This was not land you acquired. This was land that suffered you. The earth beneath the foundations had held Roman posts, Saxon monks, medieval lords, bishops, kings. And now, Almina. She saw none of that history. She saw turrets, she saw shadows. She saw a staff lined in livery across the gravel courtyard, each one bowing but not deeply. Inside the castle did not creak. It breathed. The stairs curved without protest. The corridors turned with intention. There were nearly 300 rooms, some for guests, some for no one at all. Drawing rooms hung with faded Aubusson tapestries, libraries whose books had not been opened since the Crimean War. Morning rooms never lit after noon. Portraits staring from every wall. A ballroom with too many mirrors. A red library that smelled of pipe tobacco and time. It was not a home. It was a monument to Englishness, to continuity, to control. Grandeur without warmth, elegance without embrace. Later she would say, "If you know how many rooms you have, you don't have a very big house." She would sleep in the Queen's bedroom, used only once before in 1843 when Queen Victoria had visited the earlier house that Barry had since demolished. Even with fresh flowers, it was cold. She was not replacing a woman, a relative would say. She was replacing a lineage. She ran her hand once along the oak balustrade, polished by centuries. It caught a splinter. She didn't cry out. Later, alone in the great saloon, she looked up, 50 feet above, to the roof where glass caught the fading light like a cathedral window. The air smelled of leather, lilies, and something else. Something old. A house does not care who you are. It only remembers who came before. And in that moment, somewhere between girlhood and myth, between silence and inheritance, she felt it. The weight of history. The cold beauty of it. And the cost? She had heard the stories of ghosts who walked the halls. A 19th century footman in love with a nursery maid. A baby lost in childbirth. A man who took his own life. At first she laughed nervously, but later she came to believe. She saw shadows where none should be, heard dogs bark at air, and once caught a man in a cravat watching her from an empty room. The servants called her "my lady." The butler, Mr. Schwab, bowed from the neck, not the waist. The housekeeper inclined her head, eyes flat. The underfootmen shifted their weight and looked past her shoulder. They had heard the whispers. Everyone had. That her name, Almina, was a cipher, combining Alfred and Mina, her mother's name. That her mother had been a mistress. That her father, Sir Alfred de Rothschild, had bought her title like a dowry paid in diamonds, not blood. That she had no crest of her own. That the house had needed saving. And this girl they called too young, too French, too suspect would save it. Her mother came only as far as the green drawing room. She was not invited to dinner. She was not acknowledged in London by the family. And yet, inside Highclere, in private, she was permitted. In time, she would become a fixture of the nursery, a presence in the East Wing, tolerated. But in those first days, she stood stiffly, wearing gloves that had faded, watching her daughter navigate a house she had helped finance and would never belong to. "Be elegant," Marie whispered. always be elegant. That was the closest thing to affection Almina had ever known. On their wedding night, George quietly said goodnight and walked away to his own wing. There was no touch, no weight on the mattress, only the sound of a latch sliding gently closed. And though the roses from the wedding had not yet wilted, she already knew. Her father's money had bought her a title, given her a home, but not yet a place. With George often traveling, Almina took control of Highclere the only way she could, by remaking it. Her dowry didn't just rescue the estate, it modernized it, Lady Fiona Carnarvon later wrote. She rewired the castle with electric lighting, rare in country houses at the time. She replaced threadbare carpets, commissioned new bell pulls, upgraded the hot water system, recovered the billiard table, and purchased chandeliers from Paris. Footmen received new uniforms. Sculleries gleamed. Even the servants' quarters were repapered. The red library was reupholstered in crimson damask. The drawing room, inspired by Marie Antoinette's private apartments at Versailles, was dressed in green silk, hung with gilt mirrors, furnished with French antiques, and adorned with porcelain from Alfred's private collection. She was not redecorating, one guest later remarked. She was conquering. In early December 1895, Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the throne, gourmand, sport enthusiast, and sovereign-in-waiting, accepted an invitation to Highclere. It was the highest of social trials. To host the prince was not merely to entertain royalty. It was to secure legitimacy, to win the silent nod from society. Almina did not flinch. She threw herself into the preparations with military precision. She summoned decorators from Mayfair who repapered the guest suites. She ordered orchids, roses, and lilies by the armful. Her house steward was dispatched to London to hire Savoy chefs and waiters, and to purchase an extraordinary amount of provisions: meats, pheasants, oysters, chocolates, exotic fruits, and wine from her father's private cellar. The prince's suite, the Stanhope Room, was transformed. The walls were hung with red silk damask. A 4-foot-wide bed was commissioned. French vases, clocks, and monogrammed towels were placed with precision. The adjoining dressing room was papered to match. Every corridor was dusted, every hinge oiled, every candelabrum polished. Outside, she lined the gravel drive with lanterns in red and green glass so that even in winter fog, the castle would glow like a cathedral. Almina wrote the menus herself, in French. The guest list was arranged to flatter the prince's tastes. Even the weather, it seemed, bent to her will. Crisp enough for a shoot, clear enough for a photograph. She was 19. She had been countess for 6 months, and now she was ready to rule. On the evening of December 17, 1895, the royal train pulled into Highclere station. The prince stepped down, cheeks flushed, mustache glistening with condensation, overcoat swirling in the wind. George was waiting in full formal dress. The prince gave a nod. A carriage drove them up the torch-lit avenue, flanked by flickering lanterns. Fog rose in coils. Light danced across the trees, and then Highclere appeared, glowing against the night like some sleeping colossus. Almina stood beside the iron-studded walnut door. She wore pale green silk and Rothschild diamonds. Her curtsy was deep enough to show deference, short enough to show standing. "Welcome to Highclere, Your Royal Highness," she said, her voice steady. The prince smiled. An Epicurean feast dinner was served at 8. It began with consommé. Then turbot grillé douglare, a nod to Adolphe Douglare, the famed Rothschild chef. Entrees followed, pâté, chicken à la reine, then roasts, game bird stuffed with foie gras, flanked by silver dishes of artichokes, turnips, and creamed spinach, then soufflé à l'orange, then ices, then a light supper of cold beef, pheasant, and pâté. The music room orchestra, Herr Gottlieb's ensemble from Vienna, played discreetly through dinner. Afterward, the guests drifted toward the firelit red library, where Offenbach waltzes and Strauss polkas floated into the candlelit air. The prince was delighted. The next morning, the real business of the weekend began, the shoot. The prince joined George and a team of 7 other guns. As per custom, the prince received 12 pheasants to take back to Sandringham. Other birds were dispatched to guests, society editors, foreign ambassadors, and even to Nellie Melba, the opera singer. After lunch on the second day, a photographer from Newbury, J.W. Wrighton, arrived to take a formal portrait on the castle steps. Almina stood beside the prince, flanked by George. The sky was gray, the gravel damp, the castle looming behind them. With cigars curling and candles low, the prince turned to Almina in the Red Library. "So this is how you restore a dynasty," he said. The quote circulated through letters, diaries, salons, repeated like scripture. The next morning, the royal train returned to London. The guests departed by mid-morning. The castle exhaled, and Highclere had a new mistress. After the prince, the house felt like hers, Fiona Carnarvon later wrote. Hostesses who once whispered Rothschild, like a slur now whispered her ladyship with awe. Invitations flowed, respect followed. She had money, one duchess said, but now she had presence. And yet for all that presence, the castle still felt cold. She still dined alone. She still climbed the stairs to a bedroom where no one waited. George was the kind of man who mistook distance for dignity. Tall, quiet, and prematurely thin, he was not unkind, but unknowable. What Almina would come to understand, too late, was that her husband had already withdrawn from intimacy long before their wedding. The retreat began in Cairo, years earlier, during a tour with his inseparable friend, Prince Victor Duleep Singh. There, in the haze of 1880s Egypt, a land of ruins, rot, and discretion, the two young men had wandered from the mosques of the Mamluks to the brothels of Bulak. George contracted a venereal disease that nearly killed him. The infection left visible scars, a blistered face, a damaged wrist, and something deeper, a lifelong aversion to physical closeness. He recoiled from warmth, one friend would later say. He found safety in objects, not in people. And so he turned to engines, to photography, to the cold fascination of lenses and light, to cabinets filled with artifacts, to drawers stuffed with nude photographs, over 3,000 collected obsessively, catalogued with the same care he gave his Egyptian antiquities. Women reduced to poses, bodies framed like fossils. It was not desire, it was detachment. Almina tried to entice him. She changed her hair, she softened her voice. She wore lace instead of velvet, pastels instead of cream. She abandoned her French perfume, abandoned even her Parisian vowels, because he said her accent sounded like a governess trying to be clever. He never raised his voice, but he made his distaste known. He found her too small, too foreign, too eager. She was too much of everything, one of his cousins wrote. Too pretty, too French, too rich, too Almina. And so she adapted again, not for him, but for herself. She learned every servant's name. She reorganized the household ledgers. She worked in silence, refining the rhythms of Highclere with the precision of a conductor who never gets to play a single note. And then came Victor. Prince Victor Albert J. Duleep Singh was the eldest son of Maharaja Duleep Singh, the last ruler of the Sikh Empire. The son of Lahore's last lion, baptized beneath Windsor's glass ceilings with Queen Victoria herself as godmother. If George was frost, Victor was fire. Educated at Eton, then Cambridge, he was witty, handsome, irreverent, a prince without a kingdom. He had dined with dukes, danced with debutantes, and carried his exotic blood like a weapon and a shield. Women swooned, men welcomed him, gossip courted him, and he had always been George's shadow. They had been boys together, skipping chapel, riding horses, racing down corridors of stone. They had gambled in Monte Carlo, lost fortunes in Paris, and once, notoriously, run up a bar tab in Cairo that required diplomatic apology. But if George was a brother, Almina was something else. When she met Victor, she was greeted not with obligation, but with attention. He noticed her hair, he noticed her gowns, he laughed at her jokes. He teased her in French, gently, flatteringly, in the accent George found offensive. He was, as one guest said, the only man who saw her. He was always at Highclere. No one questioned it. He joined shooting parties. He dined with the family. He stayed through weekends, then weeks, then months. Servants laid a place for him without asking. Horses were kept ready in case he wished to ride. George did not object. Perhaps he was indifferent. Perhaps he was relieved. They were all very modern about it, a guest wrote dryly. There were 3 of them in the marriage, and everyone had a role. Society noticed. Whispers followed them from the Savoy to Ascot, from soirees to salons. Almina and Victor, together at a reception, together at a race, together again at a dinner where George had not come. But scandal never quite stuck. There was too much money, too many titles. And Victor, for all his charm, remained godson to a queen. She had everything, one observer would say years later, except what she married for. And in the Red Library of Highclere, with George photographing silence and Almina arranging lilies in cut glass, Victor sat, the only man who listened, the only man who stayed. And somewhere between flickering candlelight and claret, affection began to bloom into something else. By the winter of 1897, the marriage had found its shape, formal, quiet, cold. Their honeymoon, long delayed, had finally arrived, but it came with a third wheel that didn't wobble. Prince Victor Duleep Singh joined them. They were modern about it, or so they said. A trip to Cairo, arranged casually with matching itineraries. George, Almina, Victor, and the woman he would later marry, Lady Anne Coventry. The newspapers listed their presence in the same dispatches. The hotel registers listed them in the same handwriting. In the Egyptian winter of 1898, they moved through the city like a unit, visiting bazaars, tombs, gardens, the Nile. George kept mostly to the archaeological digs and local officials, photographing hieroglyphs. Victor wandered with Almina. He bought her rose water at the Khan el Khalili. He teased her about her accent in French. She laughed more in those few weeks than she had in the whole of her first year of marriage. Lady Fiona Carnarvon would later write that Victor and Almina were inseparable companions. She did not say more. She didn't need to. The servants noticed. So did the staff at Shefford's Hotel. So did the vendors who saw them walk alone. There is a dinner described in correspondence, where Almina and Victor dined by torchlight on a terrace overlooking the Nile. George was absent, detained by a telegram. The dinner ended in laughter and silence. 9 months later, Almina gave birth to a son. Prince Victor was about to be married. His choice was Lady Anne Coventry, daughter of the 9th Earl, English nobility of the oldest sort. The marriage had been blessed by Queen Victoria herself, but the Queen had one condition: no children. The pact was spoken softly. Perhaps it was passed through Lady Anne. Perhaps it was said by the Queen herself. The wording varies, but the substance does not. You may marry him, but you must not bear him a dynasty. Lady Anne agreed. The wedding went forward. The couple traveled east, planning to visit India, only to be denied entry. The empire made its intentions plain. The Duleep Singh line would end here, with ceremony but no succession. And yet, around the same time, another plan was quietly set in motion. Biographer William Cross would later call it a pact of sorts. No recorded conversation, only overlapping silences and a baby with watching eyes. You will marry her, the silence said. I will carry the line. Was it spoken? Implied? Imagined? Whatever passed between them, Almina acted on it. In 1898, in the quiet months before her due date, she rented a house in London, unmarked, discreet, a place to disappear if needed. If the child came out with Victor's features, if his skin bore the East, she would flee there. She would raise him in exile. She had planned for scandal. She had prepared for flight. But when the moment came, she didn't need to run, because the scandal never showed itself. On November 7th, 1898, Almina gave birth to a son, Henry. He was pale, healthy, a Herbert on paper, and a mystery behind the eyes. The staff at Highclere said nothing, but they knew. One of the nursemaids would later remark, there was no shock in the room, only relief. The butler sent a telegram to George. The silver was polished, the bells were rung, the heir had arrived. Victor was named among the godparents. The boy's middle name, quietly added, Victor. The visitor logs from that season show Prince Victor's presence at Highclere almost weekly. A duchess, seated beside the cradle, later whispered to her sister, too square of jaw, too thoughtful of eye. I see more of the East than the Earl in him. No one said it publicly, no one dared, because the heir had fair skin, and that was enough. Some years later, Prince Victor gave young Henry a ring, a thick band of gold once gifted to him by George Herbert back when they were boys at Eton. To pass on to your son, Victor wrote. In case no one else remembers, a child was born, one cousin later said. An heir appeared. The silence was kept. To deny the child would be to deny the line. Divorce would have meant scandal and loss of face, of fortune, of future. Instead, they endured. The telegram arrived on black-edged stationery. January 22nd, 1901. Osborne House. Queen Victoria was dead. The woman who had ruled since 1837, who had buried her husband in the shadow of Balmoral and made half the world wear black, the monarch who had baptized Prince Victor Duleep Singh and called herself Empress of India, was gone. London fell still. Shop windows shuttered, bells tolled in dirge across the capital. At Highclere, George stood at the window in the Red Library, back to the fire, silent. For 64 years, Victoria had been the empire's spine. Now there was only a creaking sound, of court rituals collapsing, of traditions loosening like corset stays. The mourning period was immediate and immense. All court activities ceased. The theaters dimmed. Portraits were draped. It was a funereal season that stretched from Osborne to the outer provinces, and in its midst the Carnarvons packed their trunks for London. They attended the Queen's funeral not as guests, but as symbols: crimson robes, diamond circlets, the weight of inheritance made visible in every stitch. The procession was muffled grandeur, horse-plumed carriages, military bands that played without joy, the somber rustle of lace against cold stone as titled mourners filed past. But for all the gravity of the day, something else lingered in the air. Not just death, but release. The century had turned. The Queen was gone, and the world was about to dance. Victoria's son, the plump, pleasure-loving, cigar-smoking Edward VII, took the throne not as a reformer but as a reminder that a man could rule with appetite, with charm, and with his mistress seated just off to the side. Now he reigned. The court shifted almost overnight. Mourning black gave way to emerald and marabou. The older generation whispered disapproval, but their daughters embraced the change. Almina, who had always existed in a social limbo, found herself suddenly at ease in this new regime. The king liked beauty. He liked Paris. He liked spectacle. And Almina, now nearing 25, could offer all three. On August 15, 1901, while London still spoke of memorials and the king's gout, Almina gave birth to a daughter. Evelyn Leonora Almina Herbert. Blonde, blue-eyed, and quiet, she arrived without a single ripple of scandal. In August 1902, Edward was coronated. Delayed once by illness, the king's appendix very nearly taking the throne before he did, the eventual ceremony dazzled like a turn-of-the-century opera. The Carnarvons arrived in full regalia. George wore crimson and ermine. Almina wore terracotta satin threaded with gold, and around her neck, a spray of Rothschild diamonds no longer borrowed but hers. The newspapers noticed Lady Almina of Highclere, one column read, was the very essence of the new court. Chic, composed, with the glint of ambition just beneath the smile. Another wrote of her garden party appearance. White muslin, fine lace incrustations, the triumph of restraint. But the crowning moment came in November 1902, when Country Life featured her on its cover. There she was, the daughter of a mistress, the wife of a cold aristocrat, the possible mother of a prince's son. Framed in ivory light, expression unreadable, elegance unquestioned. Highclere Castle glittered once more. By the winter of 1902, Almina had become something far more potent than a wife or mother. She was a figure. She dined beside ambassadors, she hosted shooting weekends that felt like diplomacy in disguise. She knew how to seat a scandalous duchess beside a forgiving bishop and make them both laugh by the soup course. If Queen Victoria had ruled by solemnity, Almina ruled by invitation. At Highclere, gaslights glowed again in the drawing room. French chefs returned. Herr Gottlieb's quartet played Offenbach beneath the stairs. The war years were still a decade away. Tutankhamun slept beneath the sand. And the future, with all its betrayals, its scandals, its trials, had not yet knocked. Almina stood once more at the center of her house, in control, in fashion, in favor. But the world changes, and the past has a way of catching up to you. And one day, it would cause her to lose everything. Before the ruins of Egypt, there was the wreck in Germany. It began with speed, not its thrill, but its illusion of control. George found a new obsession: motor cars. He drove alone through the lanes of Berkshire, across the Hampshire Heath, and eventually across Europe. Almina said nothing when he missed dinner. She asked nothing when he returned windburned, silent, and faintly smiling. He had always been reserved. Now he was remote. There were warnings. A speeding fine near Reims, then another in Germany. He laughed and filed them away. "He's like a boy again," her uncle remarked at dinner. "No," Almina said quietly. "He's like a man trying not to be old." By spring 1903, he planned a solo drive to the spas at Wiesbaden. Almina declined. She had charity events to oversee, and the quiet sense that he wanted to vanish into motion. 3 days later, the telegram arrived. Accident. Serious. "George unconscious. Come at once." She didn't scream, she read it twice. Then she gave orders. Bags were packed, a lady's maid summoned and dismissed. She would travel alone. By dusk, the boat trained to Calais. By dawn, the Rhine. The clinic room was white-tiled, airless. George lay unconscious, his jaw broken, his wrist shattered, one eye swollen shut. Linen swathed across his scalp. The doctors feared internal bleeding. Almina did not weep. She stepped forward, found the only patch of skin not bandaged, and touched it. Then, in perfect German, she asked the surgeon what must be done. She dismissed the hotel suite and took a narrow room beside the clinic. She wired London for a better surgeon. She summoned a lung specialist. She slept in a chair. She corrected dosages. She learned his breathing, the rhythm of when it was strong and when it faltered. By late summer, they returned to England. George could walk only with help. He leaned on a cane, and more heavily on her. Then came the migraines, then the cough, then the long weeks of silence and shadow. She brought Dr. Marcus Johnny Johnson to Highclere. She converted a wing. She retrained the staff. She dimmed the gaslights and reset the rhythms of the household around convalescence. She did not flinch. She had discovered something. She was not decorative. She was indispensable. She didn't nurse him like a wife, one visitor recalled. She nursed him like a vocation. Her friends said she had grown quiet. They were wrong. She had grown capable. And she was only just beginning. The English winter returned like punishment. By November, the air was already wet with coughs. George sat hunched by the fire, pale and wheezing. The migraines came without warning. The stares exhausted him. He was only 35, but he looked older. What he needs, Dr. Johnson said plainly, is sun, dry air, quiet. So in late 1903, Almina did what few countesses would. She extracted her husband from England and took him to Egypt. They arrived in Cairo just before Christmas. The streets smelled of oranges and dust. Camels blinked in the morning light. Palm trees lined boulevards, feathered against a faded blue sky. At Shepherd's Hotel, diplomats, exiles, and barons wandered through marble corridors. Gold-braided doormen bowed. Voices echoed in French, German, and English. The chandeliers flickered over maps, coughs, and curiosity. George, in a Panama hat, sat on the terrace by day. By night, they dined overlooking the Nile. And for the first time in months, he stood straighter. He breathed. Almina adapted instantly. She hosted teas, wrote letters, watched everything. Egypt healed them both. It restored his lungs and gave her permission to lead. By March, George was walking unaided. The cough had faded. A new curiosity arrived. One evening, he held up a postcard, a row of statues buried in sand. "We should go to Luxor," he said. "They say it's beautiful." Almina looked up from her writing. She nodded. Each year, they stayed longer. Each year, his fascination deepened. Not just the hotels, he told her, tracing the Nile, the old things, the tombs. He wasn't recovering anymore. He was reawakening. By the 1905-06 season, their operation was precise. Almina managed trunks, staff, itineraries. They split time between Shepherds in Cairo and the new Winter Palace in Luxor. Sandstone walls, garden terraces, sun rising over the Nile. George asked questions at museums, listened to guides, stared at ruins like a man trying to remember a dream. And Almina walked beside him, sunlight on her shoulders, lace gloves against dry air. She wasn't yet in love with Egypt, but she commanded it. She was the organizer of their winters, one guest wrote, and the reason they kept returning. Later, the world would say George discovered Tutankhamun. But in these first Egyptian winters, between prescriptions and postcards, among palms and stone, Almina discovered George. Not the man she married. The man she would build an empire around. George applied for an excavation license. It was approved and he was given a mound outside Luxor. Almina ordered canvas, chairs, folding tables, and a proper luncheon. They dug for weeks. Dust, heat, nothing. Then a shout, a discovery, a mummified cat wrapped in linen, teeth intact. That was all. Almina didn't laugh. She examined it with interest, handed George a flask, and said, "Well, he'll need a name. No gold, no pharaoh, not yet." Back in London, George had ideas. Almina had plans. She funded more workers, hired a translator, rewrote the Diggs accounts, wrote Maspero with thanks and a quiet question, what next? His answer, if Lord Carnarvon was serious, he needed a professional. Howard Carter, brilliant, difficult, recently out of favor, perfect. They met under a sunshade at Karnak. George, cautious. Carter, skeptical. Almina, gracious. Few words. Immediate understanding. By 1909, Carter was chief excavator. Almina approved the salary, arranged housing, oversaw construction of a modest residence near the valley, dubbed Castle Carter. They balanced each other, a worker said. She made the place civil. He made it serious. One afternoon, Percy Newberry watched her reviewing shipping manifests, dictating the dinner menu, and correcting Evelyn's Arabic, all at once. "I don't know how she does it," he said, "but everything here works because of her." She claimed no scholarship. She didn't argue over dynasties or carbon dates, but she paid the workers, kept the tents standing, kept the earl warm, kept the digger focused. She was raised to be ornamental. But here, in the sand, under canvas and sun, she was operational. They returned to England with more than fragments. They returned with momentum. What had begun as a hobby was now a pursuit. What had once been a marriage was now a working alliance, forged in heat, dust, and silence. Egypt became George's obsession, but Highclere became Almina's kingdom. The Edwardian years were a gilded mirage. Beneath the chandeliers and slippers, the empire trembled. Death duties devoured estates. War loomed in the shadows. But at Highclere, the illusion held, because the illusion had a mistress. She oversaw every detail: menus, wine pairings, linen inventories. She designed floral arrangements to echo the season, studied French seating protocol to avoid political insult. French chefs manned the kitchens. Footmen stood in livery. The orchestras came from Vienna, the guest books from Westminster. Politicians from White's came to dine, one journalist wrote, and left with softened views. She placed Austen Chamberlain beside Haldane, David Lloyd George beside Lord Burghley. Conversations turned into coalitions over grouse, claret, and rosewater glazed soufflés. And yet, her true gift wasn't politics. It was people. She saw them all, from the Duchess of Marlborough, Consuelo Vanderbilt, to the dairymaid's son, and she gave them all a place at her table. Every New Year's Eve, as the downs turned dark and frost silvered the hedgerows, Highclere lit up like a lantern. She opened the castle, not to princes but to children. What began as a dozen and a pudding became a civic ritual. By 1911, over 300 children arrived from surrounding villages. By cart, by carriage, by boot. The entrance hall was filled with lanterns and sweetmeats. Entertainers came from London, conjurers, puppeteers, clowns in painted gloves. Rooms, usually reserved for peeresses and ministers, echoed with the sharp clatter of toys and high-pitched laughter. Almina stood in soft blue silk, Evelyn at her side. She handed out oranges and ribbons. She remembered every name. "Her ladyship's generosity is boundless," wrote the Newbury Weekly News. "The smallest child leaves Highclere as if from a dream." 12 days later, she did it again. But this time, for the grown-ups, on January 12, 1912, more than 500 guests arrived, estate workers, farmers, village families. The castle blazed with light. Lanterns lined the drive like a procession. Inside, the salon had been cleared for dancing. A Viennese orchestra played from the minstrel's gallery. Supper was laid in the drawing room. Oysters, pheasant, fruit pyramids stacked high on mirrored platters. George, felled by a migraine, remained upstairs, so Almina descended alone. She stood on the grand staircase, flanked by her family, and addressed the room. She apologized for the Earl's absence, with a smile that turned pity into loyalty. She wished everyone a happy new year. And then the music began. They danced until 6 a.m. "Such nights," one guest recalled, "are the marrow of England." The castle never slept. There were musical weekends, pianists brought down from London, race day luncheons where bookmakers and bishops drank champagne side by side, political dinners where legislation whispered through brandy and cigars, and the guest list, unmistakable. Egyptologists like Percy Newberry and Leonard Woolley dined beside the tragic American heiress, Lady Curzon, and Lord Rosebery. Howard Carter appeared, stiff, uncomfortable, but present. And at the center of it all, Almina. Beneath the glamour, discipline. She rehearsed the staff before each dinner. She walked the halls at dawn. She adjusted florals, straightened place cards, timed the fish, chilled the champagne. Guests were seated precisely on the hour. She could have run a regiment, a valet once said, but she chose a castle. Her generosity wasn't limited to parties. She donated to Dr. Barnardo's. She opened fêtes for local hospitals. She stood on makeshift stages at village bazaars in Tunbridge Wells and Burghley. She even established a Christmas dripping fund, where the local poor could purchase leftover kitchen fat for pennies, the proceeds returned as holiday bonuses for the servants. When political candidates she supported won elections, she hosted victory balls. Not for politicians, but for voters. She wasn't a radical, but she understood one thing perfectly. Grandeur, when shared, becomes legacy. By 1913, Lady Almina stood at the height of her powers. Highclere moved to her rhythm. The household was flawless. The dinners, legendary. Even George, now fully absorbed in Egyptology, deferred to her on nearly all things domestic. And just as everything seemed perfectly in place, the world began to tilt. It began in the spring. Her mother Marie fell ill after a trip to France, a fainting spell, then breathlessness, then the slow slide into weakness no doctor could reverse. Almina brought her back to London and set up a private room near Berkeley Square. Dr. Johnson came daily. So did the best nurses. But it was Almina who did the real tending. She adjusted pillows, kept the light just low enough, held her mother's hand through fever, silence, and sleep. 6 weeks later, Marie died. No last words. No drama. Just a final breath, and the woman who shaped Almina's childhood was gone. She raised me for a purpose, Almina once said. She never told me what it was. Days later, the second telegram came. Sir George Wombwell, her kindly uncle, who had shielded her from whispers her whole life, was dead. Heart failure. He had been her last real tie to the Wombwell name, to legitimacy, even if only borrowed. Now both were gone. Almina did not collapse. She went back to work. That autumn, she accepted the patronage of a small rural institution near Highclere, Cold Ash Convalescent Hospital. The building was modest, the beds plain, the staff underpaid, but Almina saw something in it, a place where care could be organized like a household. She fixed the accounts, donated sheets, replaced oil lamps, installed better plumbing, hired a night nurse, arranged fresh flowers in the entrance hall every Monday. She was quietly expert, one physician said. Run a house well, and a hospital isn't so different. The shift wasn't theatrical, it was practical. That winter, the children came again. Even in grief, Almina kept the tradition alive. 12 days later, the tenants' ball. George was in Cairo reading Carter's latest reports, so she descended the staircase alone. Again and again, they danced until dawn. There was sadness in the house, a guest wrote, but not in her eyes. She gave us joy on borrowed strength. Early 1914, the air shifted. Austria, Serbia, assassinations, mobilizations. The newspapers grew heavy with speculation. The empire stood tall and strangely hollow. At Highclere, the roses still bloomed in the walled garden. The boots still shone outside the gunroom. The linen still arrived from London, starched and folded. Almina watched, and she prepared. She expanded Cold Ash, spoke with Johnny about logistics, set aside funds, and continued to fund George's expeditions. She couldn't know that within a year, Highclere's drawing rooms would smell of carbolic acid, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of soldiers instead of debutantes. She only knew the world was changing. So she did what she always did. She stood up straight, she made a list, and she lit the lanterns. August came and the air collapsed. Mobilization. England braced itself with velvet gloves and trembling hands. In Westminster, ministers met at midnight. At railway stations, women kissed sons goodbye. The newspapers thickened with maps and casualty estimates. Almina moved like a woman who had already heard the echo. She did not panic. She dismissed the pianist booked for August, canceled the pheasant order, spoke with Dr. Johnson not about menus, but morphine. And then she opened the castle, not to guests, to the wounded. By the third week of September 1914, the gates of Highclere stood open, but no carriages came. Instead, an ambulance, mud-spattered, quiet. Inside, a man, not dead, not whole. He was the first. They had cleared the Arundel bedroom days earlier. Out went the canopy bed, the rosewood desk, the silk-bound books. In came enamel basins, a rolling trolley, a surgery lamp. A line of brown bottles stood where a portrait had hung. Iodine, ether, carbolic. The walls still smelled faintly of lavender. But that would fade. It was not just a room that changed, it was a world. Servants whispered down hallways. The pianoforte in the music room was closed, not from disuse but respect. And in the morning, Almina took her tea in the converted drawing room. between two stretchers under a gas lamp, reading surgical notes aloud. She had not trained formally, but she knew what mattered. The windows must open, even in rain. Fresh air mattered more than decorum. No dust on the floors, infection begins at the edges. Write to the families, always. Tell them when he sleeps, when he eats, when he is not afraid. She dressed the beds herself, smoothed the corners with gloved hands, laid out pajamas, warmed on the radiator before dawn. A basin of hot water at every bedside, fresh towels. When a soldier wept, she stayed. When one shouted in his sleep, she didn't flinch. When one asked if he'd walk again, she didn't promise. She only said, "You'll stand again. And when you do, you'll be standing in England." The nurses wore strawberry pink wool. Not white. It was her idea. Let them feel color again, she said. And the men noticed. They noticed everything. They noticed the claret in the evenings, the soft pillows, the velvet drapes left hanging, the butler who brought soup with a silver ladle, not because he had to, but because he had been asked. One wrote home, "I thought I'd been sent to a dream, but then I saw the scar on the man beside me, and I knew this is not heaven. This is a woman's doing." Almina walked from bed to bed, read to them, wrote letters, brought hot compresses with her own hands. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it stayed with them. One officer would later say, "She never told us we'd live. She made us want to." By the end of 1915, the war had changed, and so had the wounded. Highclere had served its purpose, but the war had grown larger than the countryside. The stretchers were arriving faster now, the injuries deeper. Surgeons in London were operating around the clock. Trains groaned under the weight of shattered men. And so, in the winter fog of December, Almina packed the hospital into crates and moved the war to the capital. She took a townhouse, 5 stories, red brick, respectable. By January, it had been emptied of its books, its carpets, its lamps. Almina installed an electric lift for moving the wounded, converted the top floor into a surgery suite, brought in an X-ray machine from Vienna, named the wards after rooms at Highclere, Arundel, Stanhope, Sussex, as if to remind the men that England still had rooms that remembered their names. The wounded came in waves, shrapnel, fever, gangrene. But in 1917, a new sound reached her halls. Not marching boots, but crutches and the cough of pilots. The Royal Flying Corps had begun to fall from the sky. They came with burned hands, bandaged faces, eyes gone, voices cracked. These were not men who had been wounded beside their friends. They had fallen alone. Almina made the beds herself, milk compresses for the burns, silk pillows to soothe the neck. No mirrors, not in those rooms. She walked softly among them, but never treated them delicately. She told one pilot, who had lost an eye and most of his cheek, "You still take up more space than a ghost, and you always will." He smiled. It cracked. In January 1918, while snow fell on the rooftops of Bryanston Square, Almina received a telegram. Alfred de Rothschild deceased. Her father, her patron, her believer, gone. She did not wear mourning black. She went back to the ward. Later that evening, she brought an extra blanket to a fevered gunner, peeled an orange for a pilot whose hands were still in bandages. One nurse whispered, "She hasn't cried." Another answered, "Not where anyone can see her." In February 1917, King George and Queen Mary walked the halls of her hospital. They visited each room, shook every hand, and the Queen wept twice. The war ended on November 11, 1918, but she kept the hospital open until the last patient stood. 20 men remained. By February 1919, only 2. On February 15th, Lady Carnarvon's hospital quietly closed. No ceremony, no announcement. She wrote to each family. She dismissed the nurses with personal letters of thanks. She closed the logbook and turned out the lights herself. She was offered the CBE for her role in the war and quietly refused, claiming she was just doing her duty. Her son, too young to fight, had come of age during the war. Her husband had spent most of it in Cairo chasing sun in silence. And Almina? She held it all together. Soon the boy would inherit the castle. The man would discover a tomb. And the woman who had saved the wounded, the house, the dynasty, would be asked to leave. On New Year's Eve 1919, the castle glowed again. Almina revived the children's parties. Servants lined the gravel path with lights. Ribbons fluttered in the wind. Over 300 children arrived from the surrounding villages, their boots muddy, their eyes wide. There were oranges and conjurers, clowns in crushed velvet. If their smiles were softer now, no one remarked on it. The Newbury Weekly News declared it, "Countess reclaims her stage." That winter, Highclere smelled once more of beeswax and cinnamon, not ether, and Almina began again. In London, the season roared back to life. In June 1920, at Sir Ernest Castle's spectacular ball for his granddaughter Edwina, Almina stood watching Evelyn spin beneath the chandeliers. She was luminous. Almina turned to her daughter and said, almost casually, "We'll give a ball of our own." Evelyn blinked. "When?" "Tomorrow." The staff at Seymour Place were dispatched before dessert. Lobsters were ordered by the dozen. Florists roused from bed. A quartet borrowed from the Ritz. The cook slept not at all. George had, as if by instinct, departed for Highclere earlier that day. A butler recalled him glancing sideways at a stack of ice and crates of shellfish in the hallway. He said nothing, just raised an eyebrow. By 9 the next evening, Seymour Place shimmered. Gilded mirrors reflected gowns and laughter. The scent of orchids and brandy mingled in the air. Every guest from Castle's ball appeared, as if summoned by spell. They danced until morning. Evelyn crowned in diamonds, Almina triumphant. The gossip columns called it a miracle. The Daily Sketch wrote, "Lady Almina can conjure a gala out of dust." Evelyn's season followed with success. Her beauty was classical, her bearing exact. At the height of the season, her son Porchy's engagement to the American-born Catherine Wendell gave Almina one final excuse for grandeur. She called it a small dance. The Times reported over 1,000 guests. Almina planned it all. The hedges at Highclere trimmed to a whisper. The roses timed to bloom just that week. Footmen rehearsed every movement. It was orchestration at the level of obsession, and it was flawless. The wedding at St. Margaret's, Westminster, gleamed with corsages and tiaras. Prince George of Kent stood smiling, Evelyn radiant, Porchy stiff with pride, and Almina watching, beaming. And then came Tommy Frost. He was Porchy's friend. 27, all charm and cheekbones, with a voice that poured like whiskey. They had met on the racing circuit. Almina invited him for a weekend, then again, then again. Soon the staff stopped calling him Mr. Frost and started calling him Tommy. One night, a footman opened a door too early and saw them dancing alone in the drawing room. By Christmas, the affair between Almina and Tommy was known. Porchy said nothing, but his visits grew shorter. He stopped staying overnight at Highclere. He declined to join dinners. He sent polite refusals to invitations he once accepted without question. He still called her mother. But the air was different, stiff, not cold, measured. One evening in London, he said to a friend, "It wasn't the man, it was the trespass." Tommy Frost disappeared from Highclere by spring. But the fracture remained. In the autumn of 1922, George left again. It was, by now, ritual. He traveled to Egypt with Evelyn and Carter. Almina, tired from the social season, stayed at Highclere. On the 4th of November, a cable arrived. Carter reports discovery, stone steps, sealed entrance. She read it twice, then once more. She did not rush to Cairo. She did not summon journalists. Instead, she resumed her morning walk through the gardens, stopping only to adjust a lantern that had tilted in the wind. Weeks passed. Egypt trembled with fever. The world turned its eye to Luxor. On November 26th, Carter opened the tomb. George was there. Evelyn was at his shoulder. Carter lit the candle, and the air was gold. "Can you see anything?" "Yes," Carter whispered. "Wonderful things." The photograph flashed around the world. The archaeologist, the earl, the daughter, a trinity of discovery. Reporters flooded Cairo. Headlines screamed of treasure and triumph. The days that followed were a blur of telegrams, letters, wire stories. Highclere received a record number of calls. Tourists drove past the gates. Almina appeared only once, at the library window. A photographer caught her silhouette behind the lace. It was printed in the Daily Mail beneath the headline, "The Countess Who Stayed Home." What they didn't say was this: the Countess had paid for everything: the hotel suites, the steamship passages, the excavation equipment, the lunches under canvas, the water barrels, the salaries, the darkroom, the silk rope Carter used to lower himself into history. It had all come from her. She did not ask for credit, but she noticed its absence. She did not travel to Egypt that season. She did not walk the valley floor. But in early January, when Carter wrote requesting additional funds, she replied within the hour. "Yes," she wrote. The world forgot her. Evelyn appeared on magazine covers. George gave interviews in a rasping voice, Carter lectured in Paris, and Almina hosted a tea for the Red Cross and answered only one question. "Will you be going to Egypt soon?" She smiled. "I've already been." They thought she meant a prior visit. She meant something else. She meant the checkbook, the packing trunks, the quiet nights reviewing shipping logs, the mummified cat, the dust in her gloves, the flasks of tea, the endless, burning patience. She meant the years. When a friend asked what it felt like to have funded the greatest archaeological find of the century, she said, "It feels like lighting a candle in the desert and watching someone else carry it into legend." By spring, she received no more telegrams, just silence, and a shadow beginning to fall across the desert. The tomb had been opened. The world had knelt, and then it struck. Not gold, not glory, but fever. George, newly immortalized by Tutankhamun's tomb, had pricked a mosquito bite while shaving. A nothing wound, a small red mark just below the cheekbone. But in Egypt, in 1923, a wound was not always a wound. It was an invitation. March gave way to April, and the bite gave way to blood poisoning. Then pneumonia. Then the slow, sweating descent. News reached Highclere with more fog than clarity. Almina did not hesitate. She left within the day. When she arrived, the Continental Hotel was hushed. The windows shuttered. The staff spoke in low tones. Evelyn met her mother at the stairwell. Her face was pale. "He's sleeping," she said. "No," Almina replied. "He's waiting." The next 5 nights were the last of their marriage. Almina did not sleep. She sat beside the bed, reading psalms and poetry. She wiped his brow, fed him water through a straw, held his hand when the pain made him gasp. Once in the early morning, he opened his eyes and whispered, "I have heard the call. I am preparing." She nodded and stayed. Doctors came and went. Evelyn was sedated in another room. Their son, Porci, was away, traveling in India. Then, on the night of April 4th, the power in Cairo failed. The entire city went dark. Candles were lit in the hallway. A nurse dropped a tray, and in the flickering half-light, George breathed once. Then again. Then never again. It was 2 a.m., April 5th, 1923. Almina kissed his forehead, closed his eyes, and did not cry. At that same hour, back at Highclere, the Earl's favorite dog let out a howl and died. The newspapers would seize on it. The blackout, the dog, the tomb, the curse. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, ever the spiritualist, declared it a sign, a warning from the beyond. Egyptian gods avenging their desecrated boy king. Reporters repeated the ancient phrase, misattributed but irresistible, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the pharaoh's rest." And disturb it, George had. But what they missed was this. Almina had held his hand through it all. She had watched his triumph and then his vanishing, and now, in Cairo, the woman who had bankrolled the greatest archaeological find of the age stood alone, the widow of a legend. She organized the return, the coffin, the papers, the letters. George was buried overlooking Highclere, not far from the arches of the castle he had once ruled and no longer entered. Thousands came to pay respects. Kings sent condolences, scientists sent flowers. The world asked Almina what she would do now. She said, "I will pay the diggers." And she did. For 2 more years, she continued to fund Carter's work in the Valley of the Kings, even as the press crowned her husband with posthumous glory, even as the ghost stories swirled, even as her name faded beneath headlines and gossip. She paid the bills. What she didn't know was that her days at Highclere were over. There would be no more children in velvet ribbons lining up for oranges. She had poured her fortune into that house, transformed it into a hospital, saved it from ruin, secured the dynasty, funded the glory. And yet she would not be the one to walk its halls. The house she had built, the boy she had raised, the name she had married into and made immortal, they would all turn away. The castle doors would not slam. They would close slowly, quietly, as if she had never been there at all. Highclere had never been hers by blood, but she gave it everything, and in return it had become hers in spirit, in sweat, in sacrifice. Now it was slipping through her fingers. It didn't come with a confrontation. It came with kindness. That was worse. Porci, her son, her soldier, the boy she had raised, was the new earl. And with the title came the keys, the decisions. Porci was never cruel. He was colder than that. He had never forgiven Tommy Frost, never forgiven the silent affair, the footman who opened the wrong door, the laughter that echoed late at night. He had smiled through it, said mother with practiced grace. But now the ledger was his, and the reckoning had come. She had poured her fortune into the house, 50,000 from Rothschild to save it, more to keep it. She had built wards in its west wing, painted the nursery ceilings, taught the maids to polish with vinegar when wax ran short. She had lit lanterns for orphans, hosted the wounded, fed claret to dying pilots. And now she was being asked to go. Her riding gloves were moved to the dower house, her trunks packed by hands she did not know. The silver set was placed in storage. One by one, the portraits she had hung were taken down. No malice, just order. She lingered one last night, not in grief, in inventory. She walked the halls, hand-brushing the tapestries she'd saved from mold. She touched the banisters she'd had refinished. Past the old operating room where she once whispered prayers over shivering boys with bandaged legs. In the red library, she paused. There was still dust in the corners. There had always been dust. She had made peace with it. But tonight it felt like an accusation. She turned out the lamp. She did not write a farewell letter. She did not tell the staff goodbye. As the gates opened, the house stood still. 300 rooms, not one for her. The castle she had saved had not saved her. 8 months later, she remarried. December 19th, 1923, a grey Wednesday in London. A registry office. No lace, no tiaras, no champagne, just Evelyn and 2 solicitors. The man was Lieutenant Colonel Ian Denniston, a guards officer, penniless, divorced, his cheeks still hollow from the war, his charm intact. When she met him, he was the thinnest, most emaciated creature possible. She gave him £90,000 to recover. Then she gave him her name. Society called it indecent. Porchy called it something worse. He did not attend. He did not write. He never forgave. By marrying, Almina legally lost her title, no longer Countess, just Mrs. Denniston. But she refused the demotion. On invitations, she still used her title. Porchy was furious, not just about the speed of the marriage, but about the erosion of legacy. He saw her selling off Rothschild heirlooms to fund a stranger's luxuries. She liquidated paintings, sold silver, let go of treasures from Egypt that he believed belonged to the nation, or at least to the family. To him, she was bleeding history dry for the sake of a man he despised. She married the kind of man my father would have left out of the will, he told a cousin, and may God forgive her. I'm not ready to. To a friend, she has no shame. When Almina wrote him a short note, "Shall we dine?" he sent no reply. She took a flat on Sackville Street, modest but high-ceilinged, with space enough for her father's remaining clocks and a few marble busts that had once flanked the Highclere staircase. She brought Ian. She dressed him in expensive suits and introduced him as Colonel Denniston. He called her "My Lady." She called him Tiger. She hosted a dinner for 8. 3 came. 1 left before the oysters. Her old friends stopped calling. She smiled, laughed, poured champagne like nothing had changed. But everyone knew. Porchy had taken Highclere. Society had taken their leave. And Ian, the man she'd married to silence the ache, was about to open the door to ruin. It came in February. A solicitor's envelope. Pale, thick, expensive. Inside, a summons. Dorothy Denniston, Ian's first wife, was suing for alimony promises and years of secrets. Almina placed the letter beside her tea, finished her scone, and said quietly, "They're going to drag us through the mud." She was wrong. They were going to drag her through the graveyard. In the official records, it was styled Denniston versus Denniston. But the papers called it something else, the Dustbin Trial. It began on March 3, 1925, before Justice McCarty, a bachelor judge with no love for theatrics. It would stretch for 17 days. And by the end, no one would emerge untouched. Not even the king. Dorothy's lawyers produced letters. Almina's letters to Ian from before George's death. Notes full of tenderness and worse, timing. What emerged in court was a parade of humiliation. Dorothy described how Ian had pimped her to a general, Sir John Cowans, in exchange for promotion. Almina admitted to paying tens of thousands of pounds to Denniston before their marriage, and that she had been hiding some of her wealth in Ian's name, using his bank account to shelter her own funds from taxation. As the case unfolded, Almina fainted in court and needed to be taken to the hospital. Ian's defense was worse. He called his ex-wife a liar, then claimed she had 7 lovers. One child was fathered by a Spaniard. The jury heard love letters read aloud in court. "Oh, girly darling, I hate you using that lovely little body of yours as a gift, but I am so grateful." Every headline made Almina's name filthier, and the press lapped it up. The Countess who bought a colonel, Lady Carnarvon's dirty linen, from Tutankhamun to tainted love. The royal family recoiled. King George said, "We have had too much filth aired in public." Almina funded the entire defense. In total, over £40,000. Gone. The verdict came down. Dorothy received £472, a token sum barely covering loans. Women who had once embraced Almina now crossed the street. Friends from her wartime hospital days pretended not to see her in Bond Street. A former dinner guest said, "We do not dine where disgrace has lingered." The Dustbin Trial had barely vanished from the front pages when another scandal slipped in. Softer this time. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. Just a whisper in italics. Young American beauty to sue British officer, breach of promise. No names, no dates, just implication. And implication was enough. Within days, the details emerged. The officer, Ian Denniston, the same man who had just married Almina. The claimant, Lois Meredith, a silent film actress from New York. She alleged that during the very months Ian was wooing Almina, whispering promises, dining beneath chandeliers, accepting £90,000 worth of trust, he had also sworn himself to her. There were letters, love notes, a ring. Proposals written in the same hand, now signing checks with Almina's money. Her future, underwriting someone else's past. She had just finished washing one scandal off the silver. Now another. But this time, there was no courtroom. She paid Lois Meredith £30,000, directly, discreetly, off the books. No questions, no testimony, just a check. And the cold understanding that what was left of her name had not been salvaged, it had been bought. To society, this wasn't simply shame, it was confirmation. The first scandal might have been misfortune, but the second, that was character. "She's paying for the privilege of disgrace," whispered one Mayfair hostess who never invited her again. One doesn't bail out a husband twice unless one enjoys drowning. Porchy was incandescent. The jewels she was pawning, the Rothschild diamonds, the Egyptian relics, the George Herbert portraits, these were his inheritance, his birthright. Now they were trickling out through Christie's, listed under aliases and false catalogs, all to cover his mother's silence, all for a chorus girl from Manhattan. He told a friend, "She's not a woman anymore, she's a bank," with a fading crest. And to his solicitor he was clearer still, a scheming swindler. "I'll not deal with her again." At Highclere, he had her rooms sealed shut, no ceremony, no confrontation, just locked doors. Almina and Ian left for Scotland, to Alvie, to quiet, to the cold, stony silence after disgrace. When asked if she had been blackmailed, she simply replied, "I've made my bed, and I've bought the mattress." But Almina Herbert was not through yet. In 1927, she re-entered the world, not as a guest, not as a wife, not as a widow. She opened a private nursing home, Alfred House, named for Alfred de Rothschild, the only man who had never asked her to apologize. The name was not sentimental, it was surgical. She sold her past to fund her future. First, the Egyptian relics, a £50,000 sale to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Then the Rothschild heirlooms, clocks, crystal canvases. She wasn't buying redemption. She was buying sterilizers, lead-lined walls, monogrammed linens, silver jugs, French wallpaper for the wards, nurses' quarters dressed like a duchess's dressing room. The press would call it the Ritz of nursing homes. Each morning, she arrived before the staff, gloved, composed, unflinching. She didn't wear a nurse's uniform, but she didn't dress for society either. White dress, low heels, no scent. She wrote the menus, approved every hire, oversaw every linen order. And when surgery began, she didn't watch from behind the glass. She scrubbed in, she held retractors, mopped brows and picked swabs from the floor. "She doesn't run the place," a nurse whispered. "She haunts it, like a kind ghost." But not all patients came for illness. Some arrived at dusk, in headscarves and pearls, in silence. Widowed duchesses, wayward debutantes. The discreet wives of men who voted for laws they privately feared. Behind one locked door, discreet procedures were performed. Illegal, precise, unrecorded. It was an open secret. Evelyn Waugh, with his usual cruelty, called it Almina's abortionist parlor. One cartoonist dubbed it the immaculately wallpapered abyss. That spring, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was admitted under a false name. An emergency appendectomy, no photos, no reporters. He walked out 3 days later, alive and grinning. Others followed. A Spanish royal in exile, a retired Sudan general, a duchess with anemia, a German baroness who clutched Almina's hand like a rosary and spoke no English. They didn't come for status. They came for silence. They came for her. She moved like a woman checking her own pulse. A nurse wrote. And soon the staff had a name for her, never spoken aloud, but passed in hushed reverence, the countess who healed in silence. There was one thing she refused to do, send bills. She called it vulgar. If a patient looked nervous, the invoice never went out. If someone once held a title, that was enough. What are we, she said once, if not a relief from distress? But relief was expensive. By autumn, she sold again. Diamond earrings, portrait miniatures of Rothschilds long dead, sold under pseudonyms. Quietly, she told no one, not even Ian. The curtains stayed crisp, the silver stayed polished, the chicken consommé still poured from silver, but the fortune was bleeding, and she was the one wrapping the bandage. In 1929, some invitations resumed, not to court, not to Sandringham, but to teas, theater galas, fashion shows. She came alone, always immaculate. She never smiled for the photographers, but she didn't flinch. They no longer whispered scandal, they whispered serene. And then the rattle came back. The silver baby rattle she had sent to her grandchild, returned in tissue paper, no note. The wrapping smelled faintly of lilies. She closed the box, placed it in a drawer, and said nothing. It was only a trinket, she told a nurse, not worth distressing anyone over. But she never sent another gift, not to Porchy, not to the child, not to the house she had once saved. In the winter of 1929, her name appeared in the Times again, not for scandal, not for society, for a property purchase. Temple Dinsley, a red brick Georgian manor in the village of Preston, Hertfordshire, once a Knights Templar preceptory, now fitted with lawns, libraries, and a lily pond. Lutons had remodeled it just 2 decades earlier, adding long terraces and symmetrical gardens. 30 miles from London, far enough for quiet, close enough to still matter. The announcement explained the move in polite euphemism for Colonel Deniston's health. But everyone understood this was not about asthma or sea air. It was about status, rebuilding, reinvention. Almina made sure it looked the part. She had 2 fireplaces removed from Highclere and reinstalled in the drawing room. The gardens were laid with gravel paths. The dining room windows opened onto orchards. Staff were hired, a butler retrained, the linens remonogrammed. Once again, she had built a stage. Ian spoke less now. His health was worsening, the lingering effects of his wartime hip injury and chronic asthma. He took up model yacht racing. On quiet days, he wheeled small wooden sailboats to the edge of the lily pond and released them, tracking the wind on a page tacked to the pantry wall. They were not in love, one guest later said, but they moved in tandem, like 2 candles not yet out. By 1930, Almina had resumed her place in the society columns, if not quite the spotlight. She was seen again at London balls, charity matinees, country house weddings, often alone. The marriage, such as it was, had settled into polite separateness. She lived in London during the week for Alfred House. He remained at Temple Dinsley, sailing boats and taking tea with the gardener. And yet, she still hosted. That summer, she threw a garden party for 250 members of the Liberal Party. They came by train from Bradford. Lemon ices were served under striped awnings. Champagne arrived in buckets packed with hay. Folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows. She wore gray silk. Not for mourning, for memory. No newspapers recorded the event, but one guest later wrote, "It was like being inside a Rembrandt, every detail softened, every corner touched by silence." That same year, she traveled again, back to Egypt for the last time. No archaeologists greeted her now, no fanfare. She walked the sands alone, stood in the shadow of the tomb she had funded, remembered George and Victor, and the years when Cairo had felt like the center of the world. Back in Hertfordshire, she displayed artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb in the hall at Temple Dinsley. Gold ornaments, sealed jars, even a small mummified cat. The villagers were scandalized. She once asked them to help mount the relics on black velvet. They refused. It felt wrong, said one. Still, she pressed on. In 1932, she hosted a reception in London for the Duchess of Aosta, an Italian princess in royal relation. It made the columns. It mattered. She was, once again, a countess in practice, if not in law. But the money was thinning. Her remaining share in Alfred de Rothschild's £500,000 trust, her safety net, was liquidated for cash. It wasn't mismanagement. It was refusal. Refusal to live smaller. Refusal to concede. She had always provided. The idea of being provided for, even now, was unthinkable. By 1934, Temple Dinsley had begun to falter. The staff was thinned, the garden paths overgrown, the yachts boxed in the attic. The furniture, once so carefully chosen, was marked for auction. In June 1935, she held a public sale. Everything went, except the 2 fireplaces. They were shipped ahead to a seaside house on the Isle of Wight, a place called Eastmoor. The new doctors believed the sea air would ease Ian's breathing. The island offered cliffs, mist, and not much else. Almina brought the roses with her, the fireplaces, the nurses. She began walking every morning, heels just high enough to leave a mark in the dirt path. Gray gloves, pearl earrings. She walked, one boy said, like she owned the wind. Ian's decline continued. She oversaw his care quietly, politely, dutifully. And then, in July 1935, the telephone rang. Not in Eastmoor, in Alfred House. Her daughter had been in a serious car crash en route to Newmarket. Multiple injuries, cracked ribs, internal bleeding. She was rushed to Alfred House. Almina arrived within the hour. She rearranged the beds, sat by Evelyn's side, refused all journalists, refused outside help. She measured Evelyn's pulse herself, held her hand during morphine drops, read poetry aloud, stopping midline when the nurse entered. She stayed every night for a week, then returned to Eastmoor. The scandal years were gone, the trust fund gone, the garden parties gone. But Evelyn had recovered. The fireplaces still burned, and the wind, at least for now, still obeyed. Colonel Ian Denniston died on May 22, 1938, not in battle, nor in scandal, but in silence. There were no doctors in stiff collars, no telegrams rattling across cables, no society columns marking his end. Just a final breath, taken in a second-floor room at Alfred House, a room Almina had designed herself, in muted tones meant to soothe the dying. The curtains, faintly floral, matched her memory of Highclere's east-facing guest suite. She had arranged the bed, selected the nightshirt, checked the morphine herself. The marriage had been tepid, more treaty than tenderness, and for much of it, they lived parallel lives. Yet at the end, she stood by. After the burial, there was a brief affair with the undertaker, a flicker of defiance, of something unspoken. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, it ended. Like so much in her life, unspoken, unfinished, folded away before anyone could truly take its measure. Then, with the precision of a general, she left Eastmoor behind. No farewell party, no neighbors at the gate, just a forwarding address handed to the porter and a clean severance from the sea. The house was packed, sold, erased, another incarnation folded into trunks. Her new home stood near Regent's Park. 3 stories of white brick, a rusted gate, and a tarnished letterbox. It was not grand, but it was central. Close to Evelyn, close to the hospitals, close to the last flicker of relevance. Her loyal maid, Anne Ledbetter, arrived first. She opened the shutters, beat the dust from the carpets, laid out the linen with a nurse's care and a servant's loyalty. The staff list was brief. Anne, a cleaner, and a cook who came 3 times a week. But the house functioned, and so did she. Alfred House still opened its doors each morning. The list of patients had dwindled. Retired colonels, widowed baronesses, an aging soprano from Kent. Almina, as always, refused to charge them. She simply thought it was bad form, one friend wrote. The clinic bled money, but never manners. Despite her dwindling accounts, she continued to live as if the treasury were bottomless. She lunched at Claridge's, appeared at charity galas, dressed with the same fastidious flair she'd once shown in Cairo, in Paris, at Highclere. Not a wrinkle out of place. Not a hat chosen in haste. And when she entered a room, she still expected someone to stand. By 1940, the war had arrived. Gas masks hung in hallways. Sirens screamed through mornings. Portland Place trembled at night. Still, Alfred House remained open. Almina insisted. Patients were admitted, linens delivered, wards dusted and redressed. The nurses wore starch and silence. But London was changing faster than she could. One blast cracked the stairwell, another blew out the East Wing's windows. Insurance didn't cover war damage. The accounts could stretch no further. By early 1941, the final patients had left. The staff disappeared. The building grew cold. When asked, she changed the subject. If pressed, she smiled faintly and said, "I'm working on something more refined." And she was. She opened a smaller clinic by the sea, in Hove. She called it a convalescent home, modest, discreet, quietly defiant. 6 rooms, 2 nurses, her beloved Anne, and James Stocking, an engineer 30 years her junior, who had once helped redesign Highclere's corridors. He returned now as Almina's lover and companion. He carried trays, took phone calls, folded towels without complaint. In war, dignity often hides in the smallest tasks. The patients trickled in, a woman recovering from pneumonia, a boy with a shrapnel wound, one colonel's widow whose pension never arrived on time. It wasn't Alfred House, but it worked, barely, until it didn't. By year's end, the arithmetic no longer balanced. The donors had moved on. The Hove House was shuttered, quietly. No notice, no announcement, just another address crossed out, but she would not retreat. She opened one more home, the Glebe, a plain brick building in Barnet, far from Mayfair, far from society. It was not a clinic in name, but in function. A few cots, a coal-burning stove. No sign on the gate. She called it small-scale care. Anne, James, and Almina moved like clockwork. Not hurried, not hopeful, but exact. They took in the forgotten, the out of work, the unwell, the unwanted. And then they took in no one at all. The money was gone. By 1942, the rooms at the Glebe were empty. And Almina, once Countess of Carnarvon, patron of discovery, Mistress of Highclere, stood at the edge of financial collapse. And no one, not the Times, not Tatler, not even her own son, took notice. In the fading months of 1943, Almina left London for good. Her debts had mounted like ivy on stone, slow, stubborn, and suffocating. She had sold what she could, silver, stocks, even memories wrapped in muslin. Still, the numbers refused to balance. Regent's Park sent no bailiff, only a notice, a ledger, and silence. The Blitz had relented. Her creditors had not. One friend knew a solicitor. The solicitor knew a man who owned a parcel of land in the Quantock Hills, a small holding with a slant-roofed cottage, an orchard gone wild, and chickens that clucked like ghosts from a more bucolic century. And so she went, with James Timothy Stocking, her much younger companion, and Anne Leadbetter, the housekeeper who had seen her through scandal, sorrow, and surgeries. For a woman who had once reigned over Highclere, it was a fall, but not yet a defeat. The cottage stood on 6 acres of stubborn earth. The orchard was tangled with thistle. A rusted wheelbarrow wept in the shed. A low stone wall ran along the property line, half swallowed by bramble. Almina named it a market garden. She told friends she would grow vegetables, sell fruit, live off the land. She bought gloves, Wellington boots, hired a boy to dig, spoke of carrots and currants as though they were auction lots at Christie's. But the numbers never worked. The venture bled money. Still, she performed the part. She rose early, basket in hand, picking apples and pearls. She refused to be seen in old clothes, even when feeding chickens. A countess does not stoop, not even in exile. Every Thursday she returned to London, gloved, powdered, riding the rails like a queen in quiet disguise. She appeared at races, laid bets on horses whose names she liked, and told acquaintances she was simply resting. The country air, she said, did wonders, but the truth was colder. The roof leaked, the windows rattled, her bills were back. In 1944, she wrote to her son, not to reconcile, but to request £5,000, officially for repairs and modest investments in the orchard, unofficially to survive. The trust was gone, the clinics closed, the Rothschild inheritance pawned off in pieces. Henry sent the money, no note, no kindness, just a bank transfer. He had never forgiven her, not for Tommy, not for Denniston, not for the sold heirlooms and squandered legacies. By 1950, the loan remained unpaid, and Henry decided he was done playing dutiful son. He sued her, filed a written court, demanding repayment from his own mother. Privately, he called her a crook. Publicly, he turned over everything, receipts, account books, auction slips from Sotheby's and Christie's, figures that did not align with her tax returns. It was cold, but it was legal. Investigators found that Almina owed more than £22,000 in unpaid taxes, decades of evasions, omissions, and capital gains buried beneath silence and society smiles. With her other debts, her liabilities exceeded £30,000. There was nothing left to sell. No more pearls, no more property. And in July of 1951, the courts declared her bankrupt. Her son never spoke to her again, and her room at Highclere remained locked and sealed until his death 40 years later. The government issued her £60 a week. They moved once more, this time to Cleve near Bristol, into a converted farm outbuilding lent by an acquaintance. No deed, no rent, just a favor. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 coal fireplace, no electricity, and a garden gone to seed. Almina sat by the window, reading the racing papers in gloves she never removed. Still, she tried. Every few months she made her pilgrimage, train to London, pearls in place, posture perfect, appearing at luncheons and gallery openings like a ghost of Edwardian grandeur. By 1954, she was nearly 78. Her fingers curled from arthritis, her eyes dimmed. The local doctor warned that she needed warmth and help. And so her grandson, Henry Porchy, now a young man, was persuaded. He bought her a modest home, 19 Hampton Road in the Redland district of Bristol. 3 bedrooms, a bay window. Almina took the one that faced the street. She lived there for the next 15 years. Widow, pensioner, tenant. In 1963, James Timothy Stocking died of a sudden heart attack. His death certificate listed him as a boarder, but his will revealed more. £500 left to Anne, and that he had been having an affair with Anne's younger sister. Almina never spoke of it. She wore black, burned his letters, and never let another man cross her threshold. She withdrew, converted quietly to Roman Catholicism like her mother, found solace in ceremony and in silence. The Bristol cabbies knew who she was. They waited to make sure she reached the door. She kept some small luxuries. A chauffeur-driven Morris Oxford, a fur collar carefully brushed. Stonemason Tom Page, who lived nearby, remembered her as the old lady with the car, always dressed as if waiting for a carriage to take her home. And slowly, as scandal faded, some old friends returned. Enough to justify an annual New Year's Eve party. Enough to keep the illusion of society. She wrote often to her grandson. The notes were short, charming, and usually ended with a postscript. If it's not too much, a little something for the Riviera, just enough for a week in Monte Carlo for the son. Sometimes the money came, sometimes it didn't. But when it did, she went. She booked a faded room in a sun-soaked hotel, ate oranges, drank watered-down champagne, and sat quietly in lobbies, among women who remembered the same century. Then in April 1969, tragedy struck. Throughout her life, she had always feared chicken bones. No bones in the chicken. Not ever. I won't die that way. It became her superstition, her obsession. At the Savoy at Alfred House in Cairo, she repeated it with unnerving regularity. And yet, in April 1969, the mistake was made. A home-cooked chicken stew. The meat wasn't checked. A small shard of cartilage lodged in her throat. Anne tried to help. She couldn't. The ambulance took 20 minutes. At Frenchay Hospital, surgeons removed a section of her esophagus. She lingered in post-op, 3 weeks. The nurses did not know who she was. And then on May 8, 1969, she died, aged 93, alone. Not with tiaras, not with scandal, just a woman in a quiet hospital bed. There are no monuments to Almina Herbert, no marble plinths bearing her name, no statue in the gardens of Highclere, no mention in the museums of Cairo. When people speak of the boy king, they speak of Carter and Carnarvon, but not of the woman who paid for the tomb to be found. They praise the castle's grandeur, its towers, its tapestries, but not the heiress who rescued it from ruin. And in the end, she was locked out of the very dynasty she had once revived. The doors closed, the portraits taken down, her memory made inconvenient. But what a life she led, an illegitimate child in search of legitimacy. A teenage bride crowned with a coronet of expectation. A wartime nurse in a gown stained with iodine and empire. The woman who paid to pull men from the trenches and women from the flu wards. Who turned dowries into donations. who gave so much, she died with almost nothing. She funded the discovery that lit the world's imagination, the boy king glittering beneath Egyptian sands. She nursed the wounded of 2 world wars, not as Lady Carnarvon, but as Almina. Just Almina. The girl who had once longed to belong, who gave away the riches of a Rothschild for the chance to matter. She turned down a CBE. Quietly. She never sought titles, only purpose. And when the debts closed in, and the scandals whispered, and the doors to Highclere slammed shut, she did not rage. She moved to a cottage. She grew geraniums. She kept 1 dress pressed for Sunday, and 1 ring she refused to sell. And then, alone in a hospital bed, with no tiaras, no headlines, and no name on the door, she died. But hers was a life that mattered. In the stone corridors of Highclere, where she once saw ghosts gliding through candlelight, she surely walks still, not as a specter of shame, but as a soul unburied. In the sands of Egypt, where her money unearthed a pharaoh, she lingers. In the silence of wards where dying men once whispered thanks, she endures. In the memory of a vanished world, of telegrams and train whistles, of scandals and silk, she flickers. Elusive, underrated, unforgettable. Thank you for watching this week's story on Almina Herbert, a woman who rose from the shadows of illegitimacy to the towers of Highclere, who funded the uncovering of ancient kings and the healing of modern wounds, and whose fall from grace was as dramatic as her rise. But now, I turn to you. Was Almina's life a triumph of resilience or a tale of reckless entitlement? Was she a true patron of greatness or merely buying her place in history? Why, in your view, has history forgotten her? And finally, did you enjoy the Downton Abbey movie? Have you ever walked the grounds of Highclere? I'd love to know. Here at Mythic Women, we are not driven by algorithms. We are driven by memory. In a world that rewards 10-second clips and forgets in 5, we choose to linger on the lives that don't fit neatly into headlines. The women deemed too scandalous, too complicated, too brilliant to remember. So thank you for choosing to slow down when the world told you to scroll. You've become part of something rare, a community of memory keepers, soul searchers, and story curators. Every view, every comment, every share, it's not just engagement, it's resistance against erasure. And if you believe these stories matter, help us keep them alive. Like, share, subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell history, together we protect it. And finally, a heartfelt thank you to the mythic men and women who help make these videos possible. You are the memory keepers, the torchbearers, the true heroes of this channel. This week, I have put the members I was unable to mention last week first. I will go back to the traditional order next week. Michelle Gross, Trisha Commons, Lori Weckbaugh, Miriam Danielle, Sally, Tillery Sims, Jessica Evans, Cynthia Nagley, Judy Triplett, Shauna Nelson, Jody Bertolucci, Devin Hughes, Tiffany Bristow, Carivian, Leanne, Jody Mamenga, Tracy Wilson, Ashley Kane, Melody, Xander and Shannon, Sashi, Amy Johnson, Patricia Ahmad. G. Maria Corrali, Velocity Girl, Zenlife 68, Jillian Barker, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafum Chung, Deborah Himes, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Amanda Lynn, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Jules Mack, Maureen Toman, DDH, Kimberly Ray, Stephanie Warren Smith, Monica, Krista Schaefer Hazlett, Supreme, Joya, Steve Weinstein, Deborah Chmielewski, Anna Livy, Roxanne Schuster, Kathleen Martin, Melissa Pouliot, Kelly Bowen, Gwen, Melissa Gilmore, Kelly Patwell, Marsha Corbin, Randy Fox, Lucy Gonzalez, Curious Traveler, Deb Fisher, Indira Betcha, Dreaming of the Kingdom, Sumari Henderson, Nikayla Rihanna, Sarah Blyberg Stanton, Will Kolb, Liz Karen, Maria Corrali, CTS Bathory, Snowball, Kendra McNally. Additional thanks to Ida Kloster Jensen, Joanne Thomas Yakito, Laura Lamond, Real Steel Magnolia, Janet Phelps, Catherine Rotensky Harrison, Black Cat Tarot, Chrissy Bethune, Michael Nelson, Karen Craig, Catherine Davison, Murphy's Bed, Lynn Sharp, Michelle Griffin MacGregor, M. King, Virgie R. Nelson, Michelle Inman, Jamie Sue Kalamazoo, Susan Harris, Gus the Cat, PB, Jen Kin, Michelle Lynn Neal, Michael Dean Augustine, Black Knight 5897, Wendy Fairfield, Trudy DeSwart, Susie Work, Deborah Britton Offer, Pitchick, Kate Lynch, Ram, Fiona McDougall, Julianne Scovern, Sashi, Amy Johnson, Patricia Ahmad, G and Kathy Harris. Elizabeth, Morgan Rose, David Dunlap, Moore Ross, Barbara Grickus, Frances Payne, Mary Margaret Cronin, The Moon is Blue Tonight, Julia Sierra Sanchez, MPB Angola, Deborah Eaton Kent, Rebecca Christians, Melu Marsa, Catherine Wolfe, Carol Schrodel, Virginia Fraser, Cindy Morton, Elle Stadler, Libby Armstrong, Tashuis, Albert Norman LeBeouf, Nance, Julie Woith, Abby Henriksen, Susan Gillen, Hello Kitty, and J.K. Charles Rosenbaum, Valerie Hambrook, Joanne Coleman, Kathleen Veronese, and Maria Swisher. Thank you. And to all the silent men and women out there watching till the last note plays on the life of Lady Almina, thank you too. Until next week, stay curious, stay strong, keep exploring history, and as always, thanks for watching Mythic Women.